It began with a photograph, not a legend, not a story passed down through whispers, a physical object, a cabinet card, slightly warped at the edges, its surface worn by time and handling. I found it buried deep inside a digitized archive of 19th-century American circus promotions, the kind of place where history goes when no one is supposed to look too closely. At first glance, it looked ordinary. Two men in formal attire, standing upright, composed, almost proud. But then your eyes adjust, and something breaks. Because the third figure in the image doesn't fit. He isn't standing on a crate. There's no visible platform beneath his feet, no distortion in the lens, no trick of perspective that resolves the imbalance. The proportions are wrong in a way that resists explanation. The two men beside him barely reach his chest, not his shoulders, his chest. And the longer you look, the more uncomfortable it becomes, not because it looks fake, but because it doesn't. The caption underneath reads like a warning disguised as entertainment, a celebrated giant, a marvel of nature, or the finest deception in showmanship. And that's the moment something shifts, because those are not neutral options. They are boundaries, a controlled narrative. You are being told, before you even think for yourself, that what you are seeing must fall into one of two categories, either a mistake of nature or a trick. But what if it's neither? What if the framing itself is the deception? That question lodged itself somewhere deeper than curiosity, because once you notice it, you start seeing it everywhere, not just in one photograph, but across entire archives, across continents, across decades. A pattern. Dozens of images, hundreds of advertisements, names repeated with different nationalities, origins that shift depending on the poster, individuals presented as wonders, anomalies, spectacles, but never as something that belonged to a larger story, and always the same framing. Marvel or hoax, never real, never history, never something that should exist. And that's when a more dangerous question begins to form. If something real needed to be shown to the public, something too visible to completely erase, where would you put it so that no one would ever truly believe it? You wouldn't hide it. You would display it. You would surround it with exaggeration, noise, spectacle, until the truth became indistinguishable from performance. You would place it inside the one institution designed to make reality look fake, the circus. And once you see that, the photograph is no longer just a photograph. It becomes evidence of something else, something that wasn't removed from history, something that was made unbelievable. Once you accept the possibility that the circus was not just entertainment, but a controlled environment, the archive starts to read very differently. Because the photograph was not alone. It never is. As I moved deeper into the collection, what initially felt like coincidence began to organize itself into something far more precise. Posters from different regions, different languages, different decades. And yet, the same structure repeated with unsettling consistency. A towering human figure, 2 or 3 normal-sized men placed beside them for scale, and a caption that immediately neutralizes what you're seeing. A marvel of nature, a curiosity, a deception. The wording shifts, the intention does not. And then the names start appearing. Colonel Ralph Gann, presented as the Arabian Giant. Captain Martin Van Buren Bates, labeled the Kentucky Giant. Angus MacAskill, the Cape Breton Giant. Chang Yu Sing, the Chinese Giant. Édouard Beaupré, known as the Willow Bunch Giant. Ella Ewing, the Missouri Giantess. Different continents, different cultures, different supposed origins. But the same script, always introduced as isolated anomalies. Individuals without context, without lineage, without a past that could be independently verified. And that's where the pattern becomes impossible to ignore, because this wasn't happening in one country. It wasn't confined to one traveling show. From the northeastern United States to France, from the German states to the Russian Empire, from the Ottoman territories to Kolkata, Shanghai, Cape Town, and cities across South America, the same phenomenon appears. Simultaneously, large human beings, displayed publicly, categorized immediately, and then absorbed into the machinery of spectacle. But here's the part that doesn't resolve cleanly. The 19th century was not an era of efficient global coordination. There were no instantaneous communication networks linking these regions in real time. No unified media system capable of enforcing a consistent narrative across continents engaged in political tension and open conflict. And yet, the framing is identical. Everywhere, you are looking at a body that should not exist, and you are being told exactly how to interpret it, before you can even ask a question, so the question becomes unavoidable. Is this coincidence? Or is this convergence? Because convergence of this precision requires something deeper than chance. It requires shared assumptions, shared incentives, a quiet agreement across institutions that certain possibilities must never be taken seriously. And that brings us to the records, or more accurately, the absence of them. For individuals who were advertised as the most extraordinary human beings of their time, the historical documentation surrounding their early lives is remarkably thin. Birth records are vague or missing. Family histories are inconsistent. Geographic origins shift depending on the promotional material being examined. In an era that was becoming increasingly bureaucratic, increasingly obsessed with documentation, census records, parish registries, legal identity, these individuals exist almost entirely inside the exhibition, as if their lives begin the moment they are placed on display, and end the moment the tour concludes. Why? Why would the most physically unusual individuals in recorded modern history leave behind so little verifiable personal data? Why do their stories feel detached? And then there's something even more precise. When you examine the recorded heights of these so-called giants, they cluster within a very narrow range: 7 feet 8 inches, 7 feet 11 inches, 8 feet 2 inches. Again and again, just below or slightly above the threshold that still allows the explanation of medical abnormality to remain plausible, a boundary not exceeded too often, not by too much, because beyond that point, the explanation begins to break, and when explanations break, narratives collapse. So now you're left with a layered contradiction. On one hand, you have a global exhibition system presenting unusually large human beings in a controlled interpretive frame. On the other, you have incomplete personal histories and measurements that seem to orbit a limit rather than expand naturally. And sitting beneath both of those, a question that becomes harder to ignore with each piece of evidence. What happens to the cases that don't fit inside that limit? The ones that go beyond it, the ones that can't be explained, even within the framework of pathology, because those cases exist, but they don't appear in the circus. They appear somewhere else entirely. The cases that don't fit the pattern don't appear under circus tents. They appear in the ground, buried, scattered across newspaper reports from the 19th century, long before modern institutions had fully consolidated control over historical interpretation. There are repeated accounts of skeletal discoveries. Not rumors passed through folklore, but written reports printed in local publications across the United States, Ireland, Turkey, Peru, and islands throughout the Pacific. Descriptions that follow a disturbingly consistent theme: human remains, but not within the accepted range. 9 feet, 10 feet, 12 feet, in some cases even larger. And here's where the contradiction sharpens. Those same newspapers are considered reliable when they document elections, legal rulings, financial transactions, and statements from presidents. They are treated as legitimate historical records when they reinforce the framework we already accept. But the moment they describe something that challenges that framework, they are dismissed as sensationalism, unreliable, exaggerated, convenient. So which is it? Are they trustworthy records of history, or are they not? Because they cannot be selectively credible. That inconsistency is not a flaw in the sources, it's a filter applied after the fact. And once you recognize that filter, something else begins to emerge, a separation. Two parallel categories of evidence that are never allowed to intersect. On one side, you have the circus giants, public, visible, controlled, interpreted as anomalies or entertainment, their size constrained within a believable threshold. On the other side, you have the skeletal reports, larger, more extreme, detached from living individuals, dismissed as exaggeration or error. But what if these are not separate phenomena? What if they are fragments of the same story, divided deliberately? Because if a population of significantly larger human beings had existed within recent history, even in declining numbers, you would expect to see exactly this pattern. The last living individuals absorbed into spectacle, the older, larger remains, discovered sporadically and dismissed, and between them a gap, a missing continuity, a break in the narrative that prevents the two from ever being connected. Now place that pattern alongside something else. Architecture. Not theory, not speculation. Physical structures that still exist. Buildings with doorways far exceeding practical human scale. Ceilings that rise to heights unnecessary for the populations said to have constructed them. Arches, corridors, and facades that suggest proportions, not aligned with the average human body. The official explanation is always the same: aesthetic ambition, symbolism, monumental design. But the question lingers. At what point does aesthetic choice become structural consistency? Because when the same oversized proportions appear across continents, across cultures, across regions that were supposedly developing independently, it stops looking like preference and starts looking like memory, a physical echo of something that came before. This is where some researchers introduce the idea of a lost global civilization, often labeled as Tartaria in old maps spanning from the 16th through the early 19th century, a name that appears prominently and then disappears, reclassified, redefined, erased from mainstream historical frameworks. The claim is not simple, and it is not universally accepted, but it raises a question that cannot be easily dismissed. If a previous civilization existed, one with different technological capabilities, different infrastructure, and potentially different human proportions, what would remain? Not complete records, not intact narratives, but fragments, buildings without clear origin, artifacts without context, and perhaps individuals, survivors of a fading world, appearing briefly within the records of a new one that did not know how to categorize them. And if those individuals existed, where would they go? They would not be recognized as inheritors of a lost civilization. They would not be treated as historical continuity. They would be reframed, labeled, reduced to something manageable, something that could be observed without being understood. The circus provided that space, a place where the extraordinary could be seen but never believed. And as long as it remained entertainment, it would never become history. If the circus was the place where the anomaly could be seen but not believed, then what happened next is even more revealing, because the phenomenon doesn't just disappear, it transitions, quietly, gradually, and almost perfectly timed with a much larger shift happening across society. By the early 1900s, something changes in how unusual human bodies are handled. The circus begins to lose its monopoly over the strange. The spectacle fades, not completely, but enough to notice, and in its place, a new authority rises: the institution, the research hospital, the scientific society, the modern museum. What was once public becomes private. What was once visible becomes controlled, and what was once open to interpretation becomes diagnosed. This is where the language changes. The giant is no longer a marvel or a curiosity. Now it is a case, a condition, a pathology. Pituitary dysfunction, endocrine abnormality, acromegaly. The ambiguity is gone. The question is closed before it can even be asked, and that shift does something extremely important. It removes the phenomenon from the public gaze, because a circus can be visited, a photograph can be examined, a performance can be questioned, but a medical case study, that exists behind institutional walls, inside journals, within systems that require credentials to access and authority to interpret. The control is no longer in how something is displayed, it is in who is allowed to see it at all. And once that transition is complete, something else begins to happen. The physical evidence starts to disappear from public reach. Photographs move into private collections, promotional materials are archived in restricted repositories, and in some cases the bodies themselves are retained, not returned, not buried, kept. Édouard Beaupré, known as the Willow Bunch Giant, dies in the early 1900s, but his story doesn't end there. His body is displayed for years after his death, continuing to generate attention, continuing to exist as an object rather than a person. Eventually, his remains are acquired by a university, held, studied, preserved. For decades, his family requests the return of his body for proper burial, and those requests are denied. Not for a year, not for a decade, for nearly a century. Think about what that implies. A human body retained by an institution for generations, not as a cultural artifact, not as a temporary examination, but as something that required continuous possession. What were they studying? What question demanded that level of control? Because if the explanation is as simple as a known medical condition, then the need for indefinite retention doesn't make sense. A diagnosis does not require a century of custody. Unless the body contains something that cannot be fully explained or cannot be easily replaced. And then there's the silence. No public discourse, no widespread debate, no transparent documentation explaining why such cases were handled this way. Just a quiet, consistent absence of discussion, and that silence has a shape. It is not random. It forms around specific questions, questions about origin, about proportion, about whether these individuals were truly isolated anomalies or remnants of something larger. Because while this transition is happening, something else is happening at the same time. The physical world is changing. Buildings from the previous era are being demolished, reconstructed, repurposed, reclassified as belonging to a more recent timeline. The architectural scale is explained away, standardized, normalized into a narrative that fits the present. And as that happens, the human anomalies that might have once matched that scale are removed from visibility, transferred into systems where they can be studied, but not widely seen, where conclusions can be issued, but not independently verified. And once both elements are controlled, the bodies and the buildings, the connection between them becomes almost impossible to make, not because the evidence is gone, but because it has been separated, isolated into different domains. Architecture becomes history, bodies become medicine, and the possibility that they were once part of the same reality is never seriously considered, which leaves us with a very specific kind of erasure, not destruction, not censorship, but disconnection, the kind that allows every piece of evidence to exist, while ensuring that none of it can form a complete picture. By the time you reach the early 20th century, the pattern is no longer forming, it is complete. The giants are no longer visible in the same way. Not gone, but no longer present in the public record as living, undeniable figures standing beside ordinary men for scale. The circus exhibitions fade. The posters stop appearing with the same frequency. The names that once circulated across continents begin to disappear into footnotes, and in their place, certainty, medical certainty, institutional certainty. A closed explanation that leaves no room for anything else. But here's what doesn't align. If these individuals were simply rare cases of abnormal growth, you would expect the documentation to increase over time, not decrease. As medicine advances, as record-keeping improves, as global communication becomes more efficient, the number of clearly documented cases should expand. Instead, the opposite happens. The phenomenon contracts, becomes harder to access, harder to verify, almost as if the more capable we become of recording reality, the less of this particular reality we are allowed to see. And that inversion matters, because it suggests that the limitation is not technological, it is selective. Now go back to the photographs. There is a window in the 19th century, before photographic manipulation becomes standardized, where images capture proportion with surprising reliability. During this period, distortion techniques are still being developed. Tricks exist, but they leave traces, inconsistencies, visual signatures that can be identified. And yet, within that window, there are images that resist those explanations. You can study the angles, the posture, the spatial relationships between individuals, and the geometry holds. Not in every case, but in enough cases that the doubt remains. And almost all of those images share one thing in common. They originate from circus promotions, which means they enter the historical record already framed, already labeled, already explained before you ever see them. The caption tells you what to believe, and belief shapes perception. So the image is never examined on its own terms. It is filtered, interpreted, neutralized. Now remove the caption, remove the assumption, and ask a different question. Not, is this a convincing trick? But, what would have to be true for this not to be a trick? Because that question opens a door the original framing was designed to keep closed. And once that door is open, the entire system starts to look different. The circus was not random. It was not just a cultural phenomenon of entertainment. It was a container, a place where something real could be placed and made unbelievable without being hidden, because hiding creates suspicion. But ridicule, dismissal, those erase far more effectively. You don't need to destroy evidence if you can control how people interpret it. And that may be the most precise mechanism of erasure ever used. Not removal, not suppression, but recontextualization. Place the truth in plain sight and surround it with just enough absurdity that no one will accept it. And if that was the method, then the result is exactly what we see now. Photographs that feel real but are dismissed, records that exist but are fragmented, bodies that were studied but never fully explained, and a narrative that holds together only as long as certain questions are never asked, because once you start asking them, the consistency begins to break. Why were these individuals always framed as anomalies, never as part of a larger population? Why do their personal histories dissolve the moment you try to trace them backward? Why do skeletal reports describe sizes that exceed the limits presented in the circus? Why do architectural proportions across the world suggest a scale that doesn't match the official human record? And most importantly, why was every piece of this puzzle placed into a context that guarantees it will never be taken seriously? That is not an accident. That is design. There's a moment that happens late at night, when the distractions are gone, when the noise of the day fades, and all you're left with is the evidence, not the explanations. The evidence. A photograph that doesn't quite resolve. A name without a past. A body that was never returned. A pattern that spans continents without a clear origin. And in that silence, something begins to feel wrong. Not dramatically wrong. Not in a way that demands immediate answers, but in a quieter, more persistent way, like a question that was never supposed to form in the first place. Because the official explanation is there. It exists. It is clean, contained, comforting even. These were simply tall individuals, medical anomalies, products of a less informed era, exaggerated by showmen and misunderstood by audiences. Case closed. But if that explanation is complete, if it truly accounts for everything, then why does the evidence refuse to settle? Why does it keep slipping out of that frame? Why do the records thin out exactly where they should become strongest? Why do the largest cases appear only in fragments, never fully connected? Why do entire categories of physical evidence move from public view into controlled environments at the exact moment they become most significant? And why, above all, was every one of these individuals placed inside a system designed to make them unbelievable? Because that is the part that doesn't go away. You can dismiss a photograph. You can question a newspaper. You can explain away an anomaly. But when the same structure repeats itself across places, across cultures, across time, it stops being coincidence. It becomes intention, and intention always points to motive. So the question isn't just whether giants existed. That's too simple. The real question is this: if something real once existed, something that didn't fit the version of history we were given, and it was never fully erased, only reframed, then what else are we looking at right now that we've already been trained not to believe?